Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting a loose woodland waterfall deep in the middle of a wood with the sunlight just barely managing to come in through the heavy foliage. I'm going to be painting it in the style of Ranson, who was such a wonderful painter and a lovely teacher who had quite a great influence on me when I first started painting and who continues to do so. A quick disclaimer, I'm not claiming to be using his methods here, but trying to sort of do my interpretation of his very loose impressionistic style. I'm using Milford cold-pressed 100% cotton paper. It's taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape, and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees. I like to stand up to paint, and so I like to have my board at a comfortable angle for me to paint at, but also so as the paint will run and I can utilise gravity to help me to paint and to help the water and paint to flow beautifully, wet in wet. So first things first, I'm drawing out the very simple basic shapes and positions of where I want my waterfall, my rock surfaces, and eventually my trees. I'm using a 2B pencil. Any kind of soft pencil will do. I don't mind if my pencil lines show through my painting. I think that's all part and parcel of the structure and the process. But if you use a nice soft 2B pencil and don't press hard, then you'll be able to erase your pencil lines afterwards if you like. This is my small Ranson Harky brush, and I'm going to wet the paper mostly all over, leaving a few dry patches here and there, so that will help me to get some hard edges as well as some softly diffused edges as I paint in. This is raw sienna. I'm going to streak it across in a fairly sort of haphazard way to warm up the whole area. The only thing I'm going to try and do is keep the water area for the waterfall and the pool below unpainted white paper if I can. This is burnt umber, so I'm beginning to try to build up some shadows in this moss and lichen covered embankment through which the waterfall is going to appear and tumble down. This is Payne's grey now, so I'm really starting to build up with much thicker paint now that stays on the wet surface of the paper without running too much. So this is to really get in those dark, shadowy rocks, particularly around the edge of the waterfall. Now this should give me a nice contrast between the pale water and the dark rocks. I'll have my strongest contrast there, so hopefully the eye will be guided to the waterfall if I can manage to get this to work successfully. So I'm just dabbing on brush strokes and shapes here and there, cleaning up a little bit if I need to, if the paint runs into the water area. And as you can see, I'm not painting rocks themselves. I'm not painting the moss and the lichen or the waterfall. What I'm doing is trying to set up a sort of underpainting that will give me the rough sort of colours that I need and the rough shapes that I need in order to begin to build up the impression of the waterfall and the woodland bank. So you can see as I go in with my darker paint, it runs down a lot less than the raw sienna and the burnt umber did. And now if I go in with thicker burnt umber, you can see it's still running down where it's particularly wet, but the darker parts of the brush strokes are staying where I want them to be. This is sap green. You can of course make up your own green. A nice one would be cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue. But I think sap green will be lovely here. I really like it. I've only just recently discovered it, and I find it's a really useful green, especially when you paint wet in wet like this, so that the green blends on the page with the other colours that are already on the paper. And I'm hoping that you can see that as my paint runs down, sort of merges with all the colours merging in together, it's beginning to give me that sort of dreamy, mossy, wet, sort of lichen encrusted rocks and bits of growth of grass and things like that. Now that's a little bit of cobalt blue, just enough to cement the sort of illusion that I've got some water there. I don't want the whole thing blue, so I'm being careful not to put too much in, and then some horizontal strokes of blue across the flat pool below the waterfall. So I've pretty much set my scene now, and now I need to go in and just pull it together, put a little bit more detail here and there, just to bring out the look of the banks and some of these rocks that are sticking out of the water, just darken them up and sort of flatten them out against the surface of the water. Maybe just put in a few little indications of banks and shadows, strengthen up some of the shadows around the rock surfaces, that sort of thing. This is my 3/4 inch flat brush. So using the tips of the brush just to bring in a little bit of definition of the bank. In the spirit of Ron Ranson's painting, I'm trying here to suggest and imply rather than painting too much overt detail. Hopefully once the trees go in, the scene should come together. But I'm going to try and keep them nice and loose as well. Keeping my brush strokes nice and sort of horizontal around the base of the rocks and the banks, again to try and really cement that illusion of the rocks just poking out of the water. If you haven't seen any of the paintings of Ron Ranson, I would highly recommend Googling him and having a look at some images of some of his paintings. And I think you can get some of his teaching books very, very cheaply online. And they are incredibly useful resources if you want to try and learn loose watercolour painting. As I say, he was one of my very first mentors when I first started to try and paint in this style. So I think that's nearly there. I think just a little bit of dark into the water, not too much. Using the tips of the flat brush and a bit of Payne's grey just to get a bit of movement and flow and direction in the pool below the waterfall. I've allowed it all to dry, and now I'm going to paint in some sort of straggly trees that are growing out of the rock surface and growing up the sides of the waterfall. And to do this, I'm using a number 2 rigger and a mixture of Payne's grey and burnt umber. And to start with, I'm just going to pull up these kind of craggy sort of shapes, leaning them in very slightly towards the waterfall. And this kind of helps to guide the eye towards the focal point again. If you can find ways to guide a viewer's eye to your focal point through things like the direction that you paint your trees in, or your foliage, or anything like that, then it can be a really useful sort of subtle device to keep the viewer's eye where you want them to be looking. And again, I'm drawing these trees with the rigger, or painting them. I'm tapering off my brush strokes for the finer branches at the end, and leaning them in again towards the waterfall. I'm going to try and see if I can get a slight overlap over that light area at the top, because that should look quite nice if I can get that right with the branches sort of sticking out over that light area. I'm taking the branches for this tree up over the tape so that when I peel the tape off, you could imagine that tree sort of still growing up out of the frame. I think that's nearly there with the trees. I think we'll just have one more lower down, filling this little gap here. Nice and simple. It kind of looks quite stylized, but sometimes loose painting can do. It's the overall effect that we're going for, rather than sort of having to analyse every single brush stroke. I think I need to see if I can just emphasise the top of my waterfall where it tumbles over the rocks. So I'm going to put a little bit of Payne's grey across there and then smudge that out slightly, soften it out a bit with a clean damp brush. Looks a bit strong at the moment, but I will smudge that, soften it down so that there's a little bit of definition, a little bit of tone across the top. It just helps to show the water tumbling over a little bit better. Now I left it to dry again and retaped it because the tape was coming up a bit, and now for the finishing touches I'm going to go in with some sap green and some burnt umber across some of these sort of rocky ledges out of which these trees are growing. I'm going to just bed them in a bit more sort of like scrubby grasses and foliage and sort of lichen and moss growing out of those rocky areas in this sort of lovely damp little waterfall area of the woodland. And then lastly, using the small Harky brush and more sap green, I shall then put in some foliage around the tops of the trees once I've got enough foliage just on those ledges to help to bring those together a little bit more. Nice rich paint. So I'm going to take those tree canopies off over the tape, again, a bit like with the trees, so that when the tape's removed, we can imagine the scene continuing beyond the frame. just using the corner and the tips of this brush with the sap green and a little bit of burnt umber, knocking it back with a tissue where it's maybe gone on a little bit too heavily, blending it in. And I think I'm just about happy with that. And here's the finished painting. I've removed the tape, and with its clean white border, I think it brings the painting together quite nicely. It's very loose, but I'm hoping that it gives a good enough impression of the waterfall and the lichen, the moss, the scrubby trees kind of growing out of the rocks, and the pool below with those rocks as well. With the dark rocks in the right-hand bottom corner helps to frame the painting as well, drawing the eye towards the waterfall. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you click on the bell icon, you'll be notified whenever I post videos, which is sort of 2 or 3 times a week. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon. Take care then. Bye.